All right, excellent. Um, Thank you all for getting here um, through the technological hoops that we have to leap through. Um, and I have been going through my old articles that I started writing for the Methow Valley News in 1976. And that's when yes, I'm starting. Um, and then I got the book out of it, and it was published in 2007. All these stories that I'm going to be reading on Sundays um, for a few times into January are from my stories that did not get into the book. And so I am it's been wonderful, and I've been reading them on the radio for maybe a year and a half now. But it's difficult to know when they're going to be playing, so I figure I could read you a few at a time here. And I enjoy myself going through these articles because they're like repeopling the Methow Valley um, back for decades, and it just feels richer to be living here, knowing a lot of the people that lived here and what they went through. So here we are. I'm going to start from an article about Joe Yoakum. All of these articles have been edited by me recently, so they're not as long as they were in the paper. So here they are. This one was in the Methow Valley News, October 21st, 1976. And it's about Joe Yoakum. One winter's day 2 years ago, I strapped on my snowshoes and trudged into the hills. Several inches of new snow blanketed the earth. My route wound past Joe Yoakum's house down in a secluded hollow off Poor Man Creek. I decided to pay him a visit. As I snowshoed toward the house, a melody wafted through the cold quietness. Inside, Joe was strumming his banjo. A hospitable neighbor, he invited me inside, poured me a cup of strong coffee, rolled me a cigarette, then played me some old tunes on his homemade instrument. He told me he used to play for grange dances and for house parties in the valley, usually in the winter when the workload had lessened. 10 years ago, he started building his own banjos from wood he cut himself here in the valley, rich dark walnut and blonde maple with multicolored veins. Last year, Joe retired from a lifetime of logging. Born on a farm on the Colocum Creek in 1911, the family moved to the Methow Valley in 1931 when he began a life of log cutting. He remembered the days when areas had never been logged. While working near Goat Creek in 1938, he used a crosscut saw to cut down a pine that was 7 feet across. During the 1930s and 40s, he lived in the logging camps. Those days were awful rough, he said. You often didn't have $1. There wasn't enough money to buy a gallon of gas, so we either rode to town or we took the buggy. The worst days were from about 1929 to 1938. Then you just ate what you could raise, or you traded with your neighbor for things you needed. Those were definitely not the good old days. Joe was a skilled trapper, and until 1946, maintained 40 miles of trap line extending up both forks of the Buttermilk, up Fish Creek, and around Oval Lakes. Even in the Depression, when the dollar was nearly an extinct species, good money was paid for the pelts of various animals. In the dead of winter, Joe would head into the hills for 4 to 6 weeks at a time and check his traps for muskrat, beaver, mink, marten, weasel, bobcat, coyote, and Canadian lynx. He would skin most of them on the spot and bring the hides back for stretching. When I left Joe's house that day, the snow had stopped and the sun was dancing on the crystal snow. I'd gotten better acquainted with this quiet man, tough as a tamarack knot. As I left, he told me to come back anytime, and I have. The next story, if you have comments, we'll talk at the end. I'll probably read for about a half an hour. Okay. This is an article about Claude Miller, written in the Methow Valley News, November 11th, 1976. The first snow of the season was falling steadily onto the parched brown slopes of the Pasayten Wilderness as 18 horses and mules plodded up the miles of whitening trail. With melted snow dripping from his wide-brimmed hat, Claude Miller was whistling as we rode toward the tungsten mine area to pack out 6 hunters who had been camping there for 10 days. Perhaps because his family has been part of the history of this area. For instance, his mother swung in a cradle over a wood stove at the Crescent Mine, and his father had helped pack equipment into the tungsten mine in the 1930s. Claude is interested in finding out various facets of the Methow past. On our way that day, he showed me the remarkable grave of Frank Arnold. His grave is hidden back in the wilderness where nobody is likely to find it. We left the horses on the trail while Jim Abel stayed on his mount and hiked the 1/4 mile to the site. Claude zigzagged his way through stands of young trees, slid down the slope to Horseshoe Creek, crossed it long stepping from one snowy boulder to the next to a circle of tall spruce trees unburned in the fire of early 1930s. Beneath the trees, a mound of rocks was marked by a makeshift tombstone, the rusted steel lid of Frank Arnold's cash box. The name was painted onto the corroded lid and was only half discernible. 44 years ago, this hapless man was found hanging from a tree just uphill from his lonely gravesite. The stories of his death are varied. On his way out of the azurite mine in wintertime, some say he found his cash box empty and hanged himself to keep from dying of starvation. Some say he went mad. Others think there had been foul play. Whatever his story, he lies far away from men's scornful eyes. We rode into the hunters' camp just at dark, covered in ice and snow. After tying up the horses and mules, we all gathered around a huge blazing campfire and started telling stories. It was here I saw Claude Miller at his best, in his element. Of the numerous people he has taken into the hills from all over the United States, from every walk of life, Claude says he only met 2 or 3 he couldn't get along with. One of those was a retired Army sergeant who was so addicted to regimentation that he blew a whistle for meals, before meals, and at every other time the group was expected to gather. Apparently, he expected everyone to come trotting on the double. The next morning, I watched Claude and Jim Abel packing up the 9 mules for the trip back. They wrapped all the hunters' food and gear. They struck the 2 tents and folded them up, pulled the cook stove apart and cooled it in the snow. Then they roped the kitchen onto one of the mules. At the end, every mule had a balanced double weight, and there was nothing left over. By the time we got back to the trailhead, there were still a couple more hours of chores to perform, but already night was descending. As we rolled our way back to the corrals, you could hardly see the tops of the mules' ears over the rim of the North Cascades safari truck. Tomorrow, Claude would ride into another remote spot and set up an advance camp for other hunters. When winter closes down his operation for the season, he doesn't kick back. No, he goes to work at the sawmill, drives caterpillar or falls trees, and he feeds lots of horses. I'm going to read 4 little excerpts from 4 different articles, just because I think they have interesting little facets of the Methow. And this first one is from an article on Carolyn Hotchkiss from the Methow Valley News, December 2nd, 1976. Carolyn Hotchkiss recalled the chautauquas that would take place in the Twisp Opera House when she was a young girl in the 1920s. She would buy a ticket that would be valid for the entire week. Every night, she said, something new would take place. One night there'd be a lecture, the next night a stage play, and the next there'd be a concert of singers. Several troupes of entertainers would perform on the various evenings and then move on to the next town. Carolyn said she still remembers the thrill of outside entertainment. The rest of the time, she kept herself occupied by her own imagination, by working and by Sunday horse trips into the hills. She's kept a journal for almost 40 years and is about to write the story of her family and her husband's family, the Laymans and the Hotchkisses, for the grandchildren. She'll tell them about seeing the first airplane in the Methow Valley. It landed in her father's field, and the horses went wild, crashing through the fences, and about her hearing a radio for the very first time. And this is from a Perry Clark article from the Methow Valley News, December 30th, 1976. When Perry Clark's family arrived in the Methow Valley in 1900, they homesteaded land northeast of Peregrine Lake. In the summers, his family followed the Huckleberry system. He remembers Cub Creek being a good area for those. His father, besides clearing the homestead, drove the Brewster stagecoach for several years. And when Perry was 19, he drove the Mazama stagecoach 3 days a week during 4 summers. This was about the time when the Slate Creek mines were operating, so he always had a lot of passengers. Sometimes he had 7 or 8 riders and had to put on an extra team of horses to carry the load. Around Goat Creek at that time, there weren't any bridges, so when Perry drove the stagecoach through the creek, he would put his feet up on the front board to keep them dry. One day, a passenger had a little dog with him, and it jumped out of the coach and into the creek. Perry ended up having to jump into the water to save it.
Okay.
And this is about from an article on Charlie Schmidt, March 17th, 1977. This is Charlie Schmidt Sr., not the Charlie Schmidt that played spoons in our band at the Antlers for many years. From 1934 to 1944, Charlie drove the school bus up the Twisp River. He was paid $70 a month and had to furnish his own bus, which was a 2-ton truck, which could carry 52 kids. He also had to buy his own gas and insurance. He used to keep his bus 11 miles up the river at Buttermilk Creek. One clear Sunday evening in the winter of 1935-36, he went up there to spend the night. In the morning, he could hardly open the door of the shed where he was sleeping. When he threw his weight against it, it partially opened and snow cascaded into the room. While he had been sleeping, it had snowed 61 inches. He stayed there for 3 days, listening to the timber cracking under the weight of the snow. He could hear snow slides in the mountains. And finally, he could hear the snow plow in the distance. In fact, he had heard it coming for 2 days. He snowshoed down to Little Bridge Creek and got a ride into town with a plow. The flood that resulted from that snowfall took out 7 of the bridges between Buttermilk and Twist. And it wasn't until 2 weeks later that he could finally get to his bus and pull it out to a section of road where he could use it again. And one more little vignette from Jean Carroll Hansen, September 1st, 1977. In 1911, Jean was a rambunctious little girl of 3 on the steamboat from Wenatchee to Pateros. I was always very curious, she said. I would run all over the boat and people thought I'd fall overboard. I used to wind myself around the heavy curtains that separated each compartment from the deck. And I remember the big wheel turning and turning. There was another wheel on the boat, which was a winch. We had to be winched over all the rapids. They'd throw the cable onto the shore and a team of horses would haul it up to a ring bolt that was fixed to a large rock. Oh, but I can still see that paddle wheel going round and round. When we got to Pateros, we had to spend the night in the hotel there. I remember they were excavating around the hotel. It was about to be expanded, and they had dug up an Indian skull, which they had displayed in the hotel. The next day, we took the stagecoach to Winthrop, changing horses in Methow, Carlton, and Twisp. She kept a letter from her mother, Minnie, who wrote about the prices back then. Here are some of the prices. 59 cents for a tub milk waist, which was a type of a blouse, I guess. 57 cents for an envelope chemise, which is another sort of undergarment. And then 44 cents for a nightgown and 23 cents for a bust ruffle. All right. This is from an article that I wrote on Deke Smith, whom many of you might remember, and many of you not. But anyway, he was a great philosopher. February 3, 1977. On October 18, 1894, 3 miles west of Carlton on Libby Creek, Charles D. Smith held his jackknife ready. But the Indian woman named Nancy Miller had better ideas. After all, she was the midwife. She leaned down, bit the cord with her teeth, and crimped it. Theodore Marchand Smith Deke was born. Wow. That was the last word in primitive, Deke judged, of his birth. In the spring of 1894, Deke's parents had put their belongings into a wagon, hitched up a team of horses, and left Colfax. Driving 20 head of shorthorn cattle along the trails, they entered the Methow via Texas Creek and picked out a homestead on Libby Creek. In the autumn, the family would drive their cattle to Wenatchee to sell them. An 1,100 or 1,200 pound beef would bring in about $35, a cow $25. They went slowly. It took them 8 or 9 days to get there, so they could just let the cattle graze along and stay in good shape. Deke's father never prospered, but he got a little piece of ground up in the town of Twist, where he built a house where Deke and his 3 brothers could live with their mother during the winters and attend school. In those days, he said, Twisp was thriving. There were 3 saloons, 3 general stores, 2 livery stables, 2 blacksmith shops, a creamery, the commercial bank, the Methow Valley News, a post office, and 2 or 3 wooden churches. The hills were chock full of homesteaders and prospectors, Deke recalled. On Saturday, they would come to town for supplies and socializing. In the summer, Twisp was a great campground, teeming with Indians who would bring their racehorses and play their stick games of gambling, chanting and hollering. There were summer fairs and creamery days, and everyone seemed to have the knack of knowing how to have a good time. Back in the horse and buggy days, you had to have fun when you could, he went on. Everyone would go to the dances in each other's houses. Grandma, grandpa, and all the babies, everyone. Dancing was our indoor sport. Once I rode from Libby Creek clear to Lakeview, which is Twin Lakes, to go to a dance. In 1930, Deke's mother, Mary Elizabeth, and her son, Ide, then too, were riding in their buggy when the horse spooked and ran away with them. The race ended when the buggy tipped over and crashed into a ditch. Mary Elizabeth broke her leg. Dr. Couch set her leg and would ride down from the town of Twisp every 3 or 4 days to check on her. And this is down to the ride from Twisp to Libby Creek, if you had a fast team of horses, would take 2 or 3 hours. At the end of several weeks, when her leg had healed, he sent her the bill. It came to $20. Deke has never, in his 82 years, been out of the valley more than a couple of years at a time. He fought in World War I in France, and once in a while has let his wanderlust lead him elsewhere. Now in the summers, he lives on Libby Creek, where he was born. He lives alone. The Methow Valley was settled by people like Deke, strong, with a good sense of humor, people who could do almost any kind of work like him. They pioneered and farmed and packed and logged, broke horses. In short, they got the valley going. I've always lived on the rough side, but I've enjoyed myself, he said. This is a story about Prudy Imes from the Methow Valley News, February 24th, 1977. Prudy Imes never had a medical checkup until she was 95 years old. They didn't find anything wrong with me. Dr. Stout said that my blood pressure and blood count would make a high school student jealous. Prudy's life spanned the formative years of the West. The people who settled and cleared the harsh virgin land were strong-willed men and women like Prudy and her family. You just worked, that's all, she stated. When her grandmother was a little girl, she rode a pony from Missouri to California with her family, and there they squatted on land among the Mexicans in 1848, when California was still Mexico. Prudy Lemons was born in 1880 in Healdsburg, California, and at the age of 9, the family headed by covered wagon to Washington Territory. We lived in Lind for 4 years, she said. The nearest settlement to us was Crab Creek, 25 miles away, which was also nothing but cowboys, rattlesnakes, and wild horses. After moving to Waterville, she washed and cooked for a family and earned $1 a week. Prudy's father died in 1890, leaving her mother with 8 children. In 1904, Prudy married J. Burton Imes, and she took up a homestead in her own right, 4 miles south of Mansfield. And there they lived for 15 years, raising wheat and children. They left the place in 1920 and headed for the Methow Valley. It was the year when the wind blew so long and strong that within a few months, fields were filled with sand and the horses could walk right over the fences without knowing they were doing it. Prudy drove the mule team while her husband drove the horses and wagons over roads that were barely wide enough for wagons passing. For 27 years, she and her family worked the 160-acre dryland ranch located 4 miles from Winthrop, near the gun ranch now, where they plowed, seeded, mowed, and raked the alfalfa by workhorse. They never owned a tractor and bought only one car in 1937, a Pontiac for $85. Prudy was scared of Bert's driving. So it generally just sat around collecting dust, and then they sold it in 1963. They bought their cream to Winthrop on Mondays, which was cream day. She also raised turkeys for a few years. The first year she raised and dressed 72 of them and shipped them by stagecoach to Seattle. Another year, she had just finished butchering and dressing a slew of them when 3 feet of snow fell. She hitched up her team of horses, loaded on the turkeys, and headed for town. From 11 a.m. to 5 p.m., she struggled down the grade, shoveling snow off the doubletrees and the sled the entire way. The post office had stayed open for her, and the turkeys rode off down the valley the next morning by stagecoach on schedule. In the time, their ranch was a riot of color. 10,000 tulips bloomed, 25 different varieties. Then came the gophers. They undermined the entire array. There was not one survivor. Bert and Prudy left the ranch in 1947 after all 10 children had moved away. They moved to a little house on the hill in Winthrop and celebrated their 60th wedding anniversary in 1963. Bert died less than a month later. Prudy still lives in that house, cooking on a wood range and heating her house with wood. 4 children live nearby: Hugh, Billy, Claire, Harriet Hass, and Leela Stockdale. She has 23 grandchildren, 35 great-grandchildren, and more than 20 great-great-grandchildren. They're getting away from me, she said good-naturedly. They're getting too many to count. Should I stop here, or should I read one more?
Oh, I'm just loving it. I would love more. I bet everybody else would appreciate more.
Okay, I'll read another story and then we'll assess again.
Okay.
This is about Millie Bagwell, June 2nd, 1977. The sounds of the barnyard on the cool spring afternoon filter through the kitchen as Millie Bagwell leafs through the old family Bible to find the dates of births and deaths. Millie, a great-grandmother, was born and raised on a farm and has always lived on a farm. She works as hard today as she has all her life. In fact, she still ropes and castrates her own cattle up on the range. I would live my life all over again the same way, she states in no uncertain terms. Oh, that work is just part of living, a part of the responsibility to yourself. I would be so ashamed to draw welfare. I may be behind the times, but I want to stay behind. Millie's half-brother, Clarence Haynes of Entiat, drops by for a visit and makes himself at home in the kitchen. Well, how are you? He asks Millie, and Millie responds, ornery as heck. They catch up on a bit of news, talk about the weather, and then Clarence reaches back into his memory and starts talking about the past. When this land opened up for settlement, he began, there were thousands of pioneers traveling out of the dried up Midwest around the same time. There was a type of personal telegraph system among them. Each one would tell those behind them how it was down the road. Those who came with teams of oxen were often passed up by those driving teams of horses. But in the long run, the oxen would pass up the horses who needed to fill up on the grass wherever they could find it. Millie's father and Clarence's mother married in 1900 and combined their children to create a family of 6. Driving their 300 head of cattle before them, they moved 18 miles up the Entiat River. They simply couldn't get their cattle fat in the Big Bend country, and in order to run them on the range, the Forest Service demanded that they own property in the area first. After a year, the cattle were fattened up, and Clarence and his father drove 100 head to Wenatchee. They drove them during the night so they wouldn't be bothered by cars. In those days, cars were equipped only with carbide lights, which threw a meager light for about 6 feet into the darkness, so people didn't generally care to do much night driving. Clarence looks over at Millie. Do you remember the house we lived in? There was just enough lumber to keep the thing standing, and then we wallpapered it with newspaper for insulation. Every year we put up a new layer of newspaper. Anyone coming over would catch up on last year's news just by reading our walls. Do you remember how when the wind blew, it used to whistle through the newspaper? Millie answers, I hear it just as plain now. When they left that house, the newspapers were an inch thick on the walls. The thing was, says Clarence, everyone was in the same shape then. Life was just generally harder for everyone. And the people who came through it are the survivors. And people think they have it rough now. Clarence told a couple more stories before he drove back to Antioch. One was about Millie's father and a neighbor going down to Ellensburg around 1882, buying 14 sows and their piglets, and then driving the unwieldy bunch the 60 miles or so back to Brown's Canyon. Near Wenatchee, they had to cross the Columbia River, and the only ferry system then was an Indian who had a dugout canoe who would take people and hogs across. The men had to hold the sows down so they wouldn't lurch around and capsize the boat. The piglets were much better behaved, he said. And another time, years later, many years later, Clarence was bringing his cattle across the Columbia River at the town of Winesap. The little ferry could carry about 30 head at a time, so they were crossing with that many cows when the passenger steamboat passed by, creating great waves in the river. The ferry dropped into a trough of a wave and was swamped. The cows swam to shore. In the meantime, Clarence and the ferryman were hoping the cable would hold as they stood on a little bit of the boat that wasn't submerged as they inched their way to the landing. For 3 days, they bailed water out of the ferry with 5-gallon cans. The cows weren't so patient. They had heard their calves bawling on the other side of the river and had swum back to them. The same cows had a second but less adventurous ferry ride 3 days later.